Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome again to another episode of Talk Architecture with your host, Naziaty Muhammad Yaacob. We continue with a series that we started earlier this month in January the 10th, which is the Bauhaus and its influences on current architecture education and practice. And this is part 2, in which we delved into the link and the YouTube video on Bauhaus entitled "What is Bauhaus?" and discover the pioneers who shaped modern design. So when we discussed about this in part 1, we looked at some questions with regard to this. We tried to look at what is the Bauhaus and why is it relevant until today, and how has it influenced current architecture education and practice, and why do we need to still learn about the Bauhaus. Now, I've taken some notes, referred to some books, and did my research. And this particular YouTube video by, let me get the name right, Dans Legree, D-A-N-S, one word, Le, one word, Gris, G-R-I-S, was very helpful to actually tease some points that we could work around with the discussion at hand. And the relevance of Bauhaus, I suggested earlier in part 1, is the introduction of functionalism. Let's get into this particular video and its points that it made with regard to some individuals that influence architecture education, and with regard to the whole essence of what the Bauhaus is, which we can see that for Walter Gropius, who is one of the leaders there and a very well-known, one of the grand masters of modern architecture, it is encompassing the influence that the Bauhaus had made, particularly in education. But the fact that functionalism emerged from this group of people, and notably Gropius, and how it has influenced in the international style and how it had evolved throughout the world and made its impact, and how it has that discipline that architects who fervently follow their masters, it has that evidence that I can see when I visited an international style building in my country, in Malaysia, for example. So I'm thinking that architects are a group of people that are serious in their discipline and can stick to their theory and concept strongly. The belief that they put in their work is essential, because the society or generally visitors or people who use the building are gonna feel something or not when they experience the building. And how form and function debate, how that debate came out even earlier on in the late 19th century, or suggested by Louis Sullivan then, and how it's taken into some sort of a discussion and conversation in the architectural communities, and how we would like to go and discuss that now, the relevance of that debate or the offshoot of that debate in this day and age. So that's why we are looking at the Bauhaus, because of this big, huge influence that it has on modern architecture and therefore influencing this day and age. We can't deny that, because we can argue that all architecture curriculum has the influence of Bauhaus, particularly with this group of people. The seed of the idea at first started at Weimar, Germany, and later at Dessau. And there's evidence of that building that Gropius designed and built at Dessau. Now, in a way, the Bauhaus movement was shifted from Germany to the United States with Walter Gropius. And he carried on with this influence onto modern architecture later. We investigate what is the Bauhaus. It links creativity to industry because at that time, as you know, in 1919, Germany wants to refresh or revolutionize or evolve into an industrial powerhouse. And it's evident for much of the 20th century that really happened. And the whole essence of looking at traditions, art, craft, and architecture at that time was wanting to find a new beauty, a new aesthetic, which actually engages practicality. Because of mass production and mass consumption, much like the Apple iPhone at the beginning or the MacBook at the time in the 1990s, when, the belief that you need to look into the UI, UX experience, the user experience, and how you could design it in a way that they appreciate it, the consumers appreciate it. So it's mass-produced goods. But at that time in the Bauhaus era, in 1919, we have the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century and the wars affecting a lot of perceptions on social justice, in the sense that there's lack of housing, lack of basic necessities, but yet also that this new product could be much more accessible, much more functional and practical. And the new ways of thinking had influenced European cultures at that time. So Bauhaus is quoted, changed the world. And people like Walter Gropius and others were looking at creating an environment of change which linked together art, craft, and technology. I'm quoting from some of what's been said in the video. The emergence of putting together art, craft, and technology, which we take for granted now, has been a new thing. And also looking into the architecture curriculum, because what we had earlier was more of the Beaux-Arts sort of curriculum, where you have the master apprentice and looking into styles from the past and recreating them, such as the neoclassical movement and the Gothic revival and so on in the 19th century. So we know about Le Corbusier, we know about Mies van der Rohe later, we know about Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan, and all the individuals that shaped modern architecture, eventually taking architecture by the scruff of his neck and creating a modern architecture theory. So it is inevitable that we have a hands-on curriculum looking into the arts and craft movement in the 19th century in England, and how Bismarck, the emperor, or the chancellor, of Germany at that time, got an individual to study the arts and craft movement, Herman Matthesius, I think, yeah, and came out with a report on what are the good points out there with regard to the arts and craft movement and how Germany could create their own movement. So they were looking to mass production, and that was very important. That useful objects is also beautiful. The aspiration of such mass-produced objects, everyday objects, and new objects. So it's quoted that there's a new functional way of living. We also have other individuals, which wasn't mentioned in the video, like Gerrit Rietveld, designing the Schroeder house and how it could be much more practically and flexibly adapt to different needs. So universal design was thought about much earlier, but it's not like as if, it's coupled with the disability movement at that time, but it was more of the mass production and creating a new sense of the new world and how people could be eased into living in a modern way. So mass production is really their consideration, blending art with practicality. So there is a new design language which is suggested. So 1925, you have Dessau, and slowly the influence of the Bauhaus create an opposition to the modernist approach. The Dessau building itself shows the school's core principles using industrial material, steel and glass. Experimentation was also done in architecture and not only in arts and crafts. This new campus at Dessau touches on across disciplines, and we're talking about material science, art and craft, the use of photography, the use of color theory, the use of a lot of other things in the design principles were emerging at that time. So these things you can find in the curriculum of typical School of Architecture throughout the world at the moment. So that in itself is evidence of the influence that the Bauhaus has. But I would like to focus on functionalism per se, and in the later part of this podcast I will do so. But let me go through quickly influential figures that force onto modern design, such as Kandinsky, Paul Klee, Mohd, and of course Gropius. Yes, I did mention that Gropius learn as well with the other teachers and who are disciplined or focusing on different aspects of the creative arts, such as color theory, like Kandinsky, introducing design principles, emotion and structure, and psychology. With Paul Klee, is color and form, playful and intuitive observations of nature, abstraction, and symbolism. With Mohd, is photography, light, and how using photography and photogram. There's something that he did called photogram. It's like Instagram, isn't it? But anyway, the photo montage and the kinetic art was something of the specialty that Mohd was doing. And is really one of those who use technology and focusing on multiple disciplines when he created his work of art. Well, of course, Gropius is there as that architect. There were other architectural figures later, Mies van der Rohe especially, and they're linked to what the style and other movements in Europe. And what Gropius did at Dessau is building his notable building of the Bauhaus building at Dessau and later the Vegas factory shows the architecture of utility or functionalism. And functionalism is fascinating because it is as if this card is needing to be dealt with in this day and age to remind us that we, at the bottom of everything, at the root, at the center of everything, the concern is for the user. The ease of use, accessibility, this is the ESG, environmental, social, governance. And corporations, companies, businesses dealing with the public now, well aware about several levels of needs. Special needs is now considered to be the majority of the population, an increasing number of older persons in the population, in the percentage of the population, and needing to design for, plan for, and allocate budget for, needing to have that utility and function of the building even much more. Now, we always talk about rectangular buildings and circular buildings, and why don't we do circular buildings, and the impracticality of circular buildings, because then you have to design and built-in furniture that is customized rather than mass-produced, where you can find them in rectangular or cube or squares. And we always know about this, the way we design, where we need to look at brochures and how the quantitative surveyor and other consultants would be cracking their heads if it is not something that is rectangular. I'm talking about the average architectural practice, not really necessarily the top end of it. Of course, we can talk about the designer, top end signature design sort of thing, museums and galleries, and the likes of Zaha Hadid architects and others. We're talking about utility in a sense that utility is beautiful, and how in simpler and less costly architecture it can be enhanced. We've seen villas and bungalows or houses by clients who insist on certain character reflecting of their sensibilities, and wanting even architects who design their own homes wanting to look into a much more, shall we say, phenomenological sense of being relating to their body. The movement of wanting to have a sense of well-being and a sense of place that they feel much more connected to themselves is increasingly can be shown in private dwellings. But of course, when you talk about public architecture, can you actually replicate or create such a thing, especially in housing? Can you have this less of the signature building and fanciful curves and more of the practicality and functionality of it? Why we design like that is because we do not want to make a headache for the contractor and making mistakes and so on. That's why we still kept on designing regularly rectangular buildings. And it's more of the convenience of things. But can we have a look at this in terms of the artistic beauty? That utility and functional buildings are of aesthetic pleasing and, the thing that architecture is worthy of. I mean, let's look again at functionalism and the Bauhaus and how they created an environment to teach students of architecture on the beauty of, of the interdisciplinary of art for the artists, architects, and designers. So we go again with thinking about how the architect is an artist as well. I mean, we have had these episodes before in this podcast dealing with this and even interviewing architects on this topic of the architect as an artist. And if you'd like to, check out those episodes, then do so. So experimentation, I mean, the Architectural Association School of Architecture in the 80s, because those people would thought architecture at that time, the people who I interviewed with regard to the topic, architects are also artists, or you need to have the artist and the architect. And it's the juggling of things, of looking at material more than just a painting. It's more than that. It's the functionality of thing which is imposed by society now, and which architect has to deal with it. Architects don't have to disregard this and just do things on their own. They have to take into collaboration with others and consider the users who are going to use their buildings in the future. We have known that so many, many times. So what is this in terms of the architecture education? This is the thing that I'd like to get around in part 3 about all these things that have been said: design, art, architecture, and I'd like to propose a sensibility, a new sense of looking at functionalism in the next podcast episode. So really, this particular episode today was an overview in a way of what is Bauhaus, and taking into those points that I've said earlier, the question I set out in part 1. So what is the Bauhaus? And I've mentioned it. And why is the Bauhaus still relevant today? Mention it a bit and going to go into it even more. Assertions I have made on why the Bauhaus is still relevant today in terms of the idea of functionalism, and individuals such as Gropius that took the Bauhaus principles to Harvard University, for example, and looking into functionalism and simplicity. And the other question, how has the Bauhaus influenced current architecture education? So that's exactly what I'm trying to say. In the next episode, we're going to discuss the root of it all. The root cause of all problem is the fact that there is a lack of the Bauhaus influence in current architecture education. What influences are out there on architecture education? This is something that we need to know, and this affect practice. So that's important to note. What are the other influences, and what has transpired since, and how can we counter that with the sense and sensibilities of the Bauhaus influence, and in particular functionalism that was introduced by Walter Gropius. So hence, this will also conclude why we still need to learn about the Bauhaus. So I'll be seeing you in part 3, and the concluding part of this topic of the Bauhaus and its influences on current architecture education and practice. And I hope there will be offshoots, episodes on this topic later on, and make it much more fun with guest speakers and so on. So thank you very much for listening in. Thank you for your patience, and I'm eternally thankful that you are listening to these topics and creating a discussion out there, creating a dialogue and conversation out there with regard to these topics that are very, very important. Now we know it as what it is now in this 21st century. Thank you very much.